Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about something that's done a lot these days that is oftentimes termed functional training. But when you think about it, it's actually inferior to conventional barbell training. And that's doing different exercises either on an unstable surface or using them in a unilateral manner in an attempt to create overload with more stability. And perfect examples would be squatting on a Bosu ball. That's probably a horrific example, but you guys know what I'm talking about. So squatting on an unstable surface, overhead pressing on an unstable surface, or doing these sort of movements with unilaterally, with one arm or with one leg at a time. And the problem with this is that what it does is that it actually reduces maximum load. And it's done usually, again, to either create an artificial environment where the body is having to stabilize itself more because of different side shifting, even though you're forced to use a much lighter weight, or it is used to attempt to overload each side of the body individually while reducing core involvement because not as much weight is put upon the body, such as like the one-legged loaded pistol squats with dumbbells, or a one-arm standing dumbbell push press, things like that. Now the problem with this is that, again, we are back to the point of attempting to do things in a manner that reduces maximum load put upon the body, and that reduced maximum load, of course, produces less than maximum development. Biggest example is, again, squatting or pressing on an unstable surface. Let me ask you guys a very simple question. If your goal was to make someone as strong and as stable as possible for sports purposes or some sort of functional fitness or practical purposes, what's going to develop better stability through the whole body? The ability to squat 300 pounds for reps, deep ass to grass squats, say 300 or 315 for reps, or standing on an unstable surface squatting 135. Or how about getting your max squat up to 400 or 500 pounds? When you think about it from a practical perspective, let's say field athletes, contact sport athletes, the ladder of using very heavy weights already builds up all these stabilizer muscles, because you're having to stabilize a weight that is well above your body weight, sitting up on top of your back and moving it through a full range of motion. Furthermore, it can be done more safely. It's far less risk of injury. You're going to develop a tremendous amount of additional strength, and you're going to work all these stabilizers just as much, because you're not going to be completely limited by the stabilizer muscles as far as maximum resistance goes. It's superior. It works for a reason, and we've known this for decades, that, again, just heavy barbell squats, heavy barbell movements create more stable athletes who have stronger cores, and they're able to handle these environments in the real world better than putting them in an artificial environment where you're creating an unstable surface to move on. It just doesn't work as well. And it's a silly theory, because you're attempting to train a separate performance element that's already covered with the maximum strength training to begin with. That's going to be trained maximally as well. And it doesn't matter whether it's a overhead press or a squat or anything like that. It produces superior results. Now, the other thing that people do, they'll try to, again, do things like one-legged squats. And this is exactly the sort of thing that's been called out by experts who don't use these methods, who look at the nonsense of it, is this is stuff that's done in an effort to be trendy. And the idea here is that people are trying to make their legs be the limiting factor in their ability to squat, and saying, okay, well, we want to make the squat kind of like a leg press, in the sense of we just don't want to load up the core and the spine and everything else as much, so the legs will be the limiting factor. Well, the end result of this is that your core and everything else doesn't get as developed. And that's what people need to remember. Very rarely, if you train correctly on a balanced program, you know what? Your core doesn't become the limiting factor. Your erectors do not become the limiting factor in your ability to barbell squat, because they grow and develop proportionately with your legs and glutes and hips and everything else. And you're doing so in a manner that's, again, very functional. The problem you run into with some of these one-legged exercises people tend to do is that what ends up happening is that things like dorsiflexion and other things like that become your limiting factor. It becomes very, very difficult to train the exercise through a full range of motion. So ultimately you end up with less total athletic performance. And again, oftentimes people who are doing these heavy, they're not able to achieve the same amount of respectable range of motion that they're loading the body with a barbell. And conversely, you very, very rarely see anyone with pronounced leg development doing this. We see certain people who do these things only, and then you look at the amount of time they've been training their development, and actually their leg development ends up being subpar because they oftentimes are limited on things like range of motion. And we know that partial range of motion produces slightly inferior hypertrophy to full range of motion exercises as far as effective range of motion. Well, the effective range of motion on these exercises gets limited. Most people, when they start holding dumbbells or anything else, they can't pistol squat to the same depth they can with a barbell. So they end up shortchanging their leg development. They end up shortchanging their hip development, and then their core, erectors, and everything else don't receive the same degree of overload. And that ultimately leads to a weaker individual. It leads to a much weaker individual than if they had just got maximally strong with a barbell. And that's the problem. It's like things like one-legged pistol squats are a solution looking for a problem. The barbell squat isn't broke. It works amazingly well for athletes. It's tried and true. And this is, again, trendy stuff that people come up with is a perceived problem with the barbell squat that they want to fix, but there's not actually a real problem there that exists. And ultimately, all these sort of exercises do is end up shortchanging overall development, shortchanging overall athleticism, again, reduce strength through the full joint angles, a weaker core, and even though they're trying to balance themselves, they end up with someone who's less stable than if they had just done the conventional exercise. And ultimately, exercises like this maybe have their place as accessory work for people who are struggling with the axial loading of the amount of volume they're doing. But I'm just going to be frank here. I talk a lot about needing to recover from axial loading, but if you only squat 315 for 5 reps and you're a healthy male, that's just simply not enough. You're not able to generate enough workload through axial loading. This becomes a problem. When we talk about axial loading being a recovery issue, this is not for novice people. This isn't for people who are still building a strength base. I would go out on a limb and say people who aren't probably squatting 500 plus pounds or deadlifting 600 plus pounds as healthy young men don't really need to concern themselves with these things. These are the sort of things you start worrying about in your programming when you are brutally strong. When you're brutally strong, not when you squat 400 pounds. So again, this stuff gets a little overhyped. And again, I understand the need for certain types of athletes who have a work capacity that can exceed their recovery ability, and the axial loading is an issue. But for people still building a base, and if you're squatting 350 pounds, you are still building a base. Just flat out. That's just the reality of it. And even then, you still may not need to resort to these even when you're squatting over 500 pounds. I'm not saying they don't have their place, but this is the sort of thing that's overused as a trendy thing, and it basically just gives people an excuse to not actually get strong, which doesn't make them as good of an athlete in the long term. And the same could be said for things like doing one-arm dumbbell overhead presses, which are a nice exercise, but again, you end up getting shortchanged on your total overload. They end up with less total development because you're spending more time having to deal with side loading it. And again, because of the bar pass that sometimes are involved, you could end up putting your shoulders in a compromised position. In other words, you're dealing with an exercise that, again, maybe has its merits, might have its place, but as a primary exercise, probably not. Because again, you're doing it fresh. You're going to be dealing with workloads and tonnages to where when you're having to deal with doing them one-armed, it's actually riskier than just doing a strict standing press or a push press with a barbell. And again, back to the point, we talk about building tremendously powerful athletes. Barbell overhead standing work is always going to be a key component of that, it's particularly for any sort of contact sport athlete. So again, we're kind of back to the point of people trying to find a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. Doing big, heavy, full range of motion barbell overhead work is one of the best things you can possibly do to improve your overall athleticism. There's no need to remove this effective exercise to, again, do a little bit of showboating and what's being called functional fitness when it's actually not even as functional as traditional training. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.